At some point, a random guy convinced an entire society that he was special, put a shiny hat on his head, and everyone just went along with it. That's kings. That's genuinely how this started. And the ancient Sumerians even wrote down a list of the very first ones, including one guy who apparently ruled for 28,800 years. Let's talk about how humans actually invented kings, because the propaganda involved is unhinged. And before you assume kings just appeared out of nowhere one day, nope. This was a gradual, calculated transition, starting from a completely different system of power, involving actual war leaders, a genuine power struggle between two rival institutions, and honestly, some of the earliest recorded propaganda in human history. Let's actually break down how this happened. Quick thing before we dive in. If you're new here, we cover ancient history like this every week, real sources, zero boring lecture energy. Hit follow now so you don't miss the next one. So here's a genuinely important detail most people skip. Kingship wasn't the original form of government in early civilization. In the earliest Mesopotamian cities, places like Uruk, during a period researchers call the Uruk period, roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE, the temple was actually the center of power, not a king. A priest, essentially running things on behalf of the gods, organizing labor, managing food distribution, and handling the practical, day-to-day administration of an entire growing city. Think of it less like a religious building in the modern sense, and way more like City Hall, a food bank, and a church all combined into one massive institution, with the head priest functioning as the closest thing to a chief executive these early cities had. It was in a lot of ways genuinely more communal. Political power in these early city-states is believed to have originally belonged more broadly to the citizens, coordinated through this temple system, rather than concentrated in one single, all-powerful ruler. So if temples were already running things reasonably well, the obvious question is, why did that change? Why did an entirely new position, one single person holding personal, concentrated power, even become necessary in the first place? Turns out, the answer to that question is depressingly simple, and it's basically the same answer to half of human history's biggest changes: conflict. Specifically, the need for someone to actually lead people into a fight. So, as early cities grew larger and wealthier, they became genuinely attractive targets for raids, for resource competition, for straight-up conflict with neighboring settlements over land, water, and trade access. And here's the thing about temple-based distributed governance. It's honestly not great at making fast, centralized military decisions during an actual crisis. A council or a priest managing food distribution is a very different skill set than someone who needs to make split-second calls in an active raid or defend a city under attack. So communities started temporarily elevating a single, capable individual specifically to lead them through moments of conflict, someone with proven military skill and effective leadership. The Sumerians actually had a specific term for this figure, Lugal, which translates roughly to big man or great man. Initially, this looks like it was genuinely meant to be a temporary role, someone stepping up during a crisis, then stepping back down once the immediate danger passed, similar to how some societies still appoint emergency leadership during a war, and then return to normal governance afterward. Except, here's the part that changed everything. Conflict between competing city-states didn't really stop. It kept recurring again and again, which meant these temporary war leaders kept getting re-elevated, crisis after crisis, until the role gradually stopped feeling temporary at all. And once a Lugal had real, proven military backing and a track record of successfully protecting the city, stepping back down to hand power back over to the temple administration became less and less realistic. Somewhere in that repeated cycle, temporary emergency war leader quietly calcified into permanent ruler. Kingship wasn't announced. It just never fully ended after the first few crises. So now you've got a permanent war leader with real power. But the temple is still technically in charge of the city. 2 power centers, 1 city, and that tension had to get resolved somehow. Spoiler, it got resolved by the king literally building a rival headquarters. So archaeologists have actually found direct physical evidence of this power shift. In Uruk specifically, they've uncovered a massive complex called the Iana Precinct, which functioned as a political and economic power center existing right alongside and competing with the temple. This is where kings started building their own institution, the palace, a genuinely deliberate rival to the temple's authority, gradually absorbing more and more of the administrative functions the temple used to fully control on its own. But building a bigger building isn't enough to justify permanent, singular power over an entire city. So these early kings did something genuinely clever and, honestly, kind of shameless. They borrowed the temple's own playbook. They started claiming divine legitimacy for themselves, positioning kingship not as something humans had just kind of stumbled into out of repeated wartime necessity, but as a gift handed down directly from the gods. And this is where we get to one of my favorite pieces of ancient propaganda in all of history, a document called the Sumerian King List. It opens with the line, translated roughly as, "When kingship descended from heaven," immediately framing kings not as elevated war leaders, but as part of a cosmic, divinely ordained system that had supposedly always existed. And then it lists the very first kings, before a great flood, with reign lengths that are genuinely absurd. The very first king, Alulim, is recorded as ruling for 28,800 years. The total reign length of all 8 kings before the flood adds up to 241,200 years combined. These are not typos. This is deliberate, mythologized history designed specifically to make kingship look ancient, cosmic, and inevitable rather than what it actually was. A fairly recent, gradual, very human power grab that started with a guy who was just good at organizing a defense. So kings had built palaces, claimed divine backing, and rewritten their own origin story. But some researchers think there's an even darker, more cynical explanation hiding underneath all of this. One archaeologist even compared the whole system to something you'd expect from organized crime. So, archaeologist Bruce Dixon proposed a genuinely provocative reinterpretation of early kingship using conflict theory, based specifically on evidence from the royal tombs of Ur, a set of ancient burial sites where kings and elite figures were buried alongside dozens of attendants, sacrificed to accompany them into the afterlife. Dixon's argument is that this entire system functioned less like a benevolent, divinely appointed leadership structure and more like a protection racket. The king's power ultimately rested on the implicit threat of violence extracting loyalty, labor, and resources from the population under the framing of protection and divine order, backed by displays of absolute power extreme enough to include human sacrifice at burial. Now, this is genuinely one interpretation among several competing theories. Not every historian fully agrees with framing it this bluntly. But it's a legitimate, seriously considered academic perspective, and it adds a genuinely uncomfortable layer underneath all that impressive divine mythology and propaganda we just covered. Underneath the palaces, the claims of descending from heaven and the absurd 28,800-year reigns, some researchers think the actual foundation of kingship was much simpler and much darker. A credible threat of force dressed up in enough ceremony and mythology that most people stopped questioning it. So here's the actual takeaway. Kings weren't some ancient, inevitable, divinely ordained institution that had always existed. They were a genuinely recent, gradual human invention. Starting as temporary emergency war leaders who kept getting re-elevated during repeated conflict until stepping back down stopped being realistic, then backed up their new permanent power with palaces, propaganda, and increasingly bold claims of divine origin, all the way up to a written history claiming the very first kings ruled for tens of thousands of years each. Whether you take the more charitable read, leadership that emerged naturally out of genuine necessity, or the darker read some researchers propose, power maintained through implied threat dressed up as divine order. The core truth stays the same. Kingship wasn't handed down from the heavens. It was built piece by very mortal people and then very deliberately mythologized to look like it never could have been any other way. If nobody taught you the actual origin story behind this in school, follow. We cover ancient history like this every single week. Comment which theory you buy more, the gradual necessity version or the protection racket version, because honestly, I think it's probably both. And if you want more of this same ancient power structures were wilder than you think energy, check out the video on the fall of Rome linked right here. Different empire, same kind of unraveling.